The definition of type 1 and type 2 error. A type 1 error happens if the null hypothesis is rejected when it's true. Type 2 error happens when the null hypothesis is not rejected when it is false. So you have a false hypothesis and you don't reject it. Use the following table, write everything nicely in compact form. The decision and truthness of null hypothesis. If the null hypothesis is true, and once the null hypothesis is false, we have two scenarios for each hypothesis, either true or it's false. Null hypothesis is true, and you do not reject the null hypothesis. It means that it's a correct decision. Null hypothesis is true, but you reject the null hypothesis. This is called the type 1 error. The intersection between null is true, reject null is type 1 error. But when null hypothesis is false and you don't reject it, so null hypothesis is false and you don't reject it, you have a type 2 error. Null hypothesis is false and you reject the null hypothesis. It means that you have a correct decision. So you have two scenarios with correct decision. Null hypothesis is true and you don't reject it. It's a correct decision. And when null hypothesis is false and you reject it, it is a correct decision. In either cases, you're going to have error. Take a look at this example. So the USDA limit for Salmonella contamination for chicken is 20%. A meat inspector reports that, claims that the chicken produced by a company exceeds the USDA limit. As a statistician, you perform a hypothesis test to determine whether the meat inspector claim is true or not. When will a type 1 or type 2 error happen? Which one is more serious? It's about the health of chicken. Chicken goes to the market and people consume the chicken. Remember the definition of type 1 and type 2 error. Type 1 error, when the null hypothesis is true, but you reject the null hypothesis. Type 2 error, when null hypothesis is false and you don't reject the null hypothesis. So let us form the null and alternative hypothesis and then talk about the type 1 and type 2 error in these scenarios. Suppose P represents the proportion of the chicken that is contaminated. The meat inspectors claim that more than 20% is contaminated, more than 20%. And it says exceed, it means that it is more than 20%. So it says the proportion of contamination is more than 20%. And this is our alternative hypothesis because it doesn't have any equality. The null hypothesis is the proportion is less than or equal to 20%. Type 1 error happens when the actual proportion of contaminated chicken is less than or equal to 20%. Remember that it's about null hypothesis, but you reject the null hypothesis. So again, type 1 error happens when the actual proportion is less than or equal to 20%, but you reject that chicken. The proportion of contamination doesn't exceed 20%, but you reject it. You reject that chicken. A type 2 error happens when the actual proportion is more than 20%. Remember that null hypothesis is false. It means that it's more than 20%, but you don't reject that chicken. You say that, hey, that chicken is healthy. With a type 1 error, you might create a health scare and hurt the sales of chicken producers who were actually meeting the USDA limits. With a type 2 error, you could be allowing chicken with contamination go into the market and somebody consume that chicken. So type 2 error in this example is more serious.